makes his triumphant return to the screen in A Haunting in Venice, the third film in his series centered on the legendary detective Hercule Poirot. This movie was one that I was somehow highly anticipating. And I say somehow because I was torn between a few things that made me both excited for it and also leery at the same time. On the one hand, I love mysteries, and I love the character of Poirot in general, so any new iteration of the character or telling of these stories is cause for at least intrigue, and hopefully celebration. On the other, I didn't love its predecessor, Death on the Nile, even though I enjoyed it enough for what it was, a big screen whodunit that would always suffer in comparison to the John Guillermin original. And the trailers for A Haunting in Venice left me interested, but also underwhelmed. And to top it all off, I am by no means a horror fan. The scariest I'll go is maybe a Val Lewton RKO movie, but I'll likely lean more towards Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein if given the choice. So, the other day, I sat down to see what direction Kenneth Branagh was going to take this series in next. And now, I've got some thoughts. Before we get going, I'll just say that I'm going to avoid spoilers for the bulk of this review. If I mention something that borders on that territory, it will be something that was shown in the marketing of the film. I'll reserve my most spoilery comments for a section towards the end of this review. Anyway, the film opens in 1947, a whopping 10 years after the events of Death on the Nile. And my goodness, Hercule Poirot hasn't aged a day. In fact, he may even be aging backwards. Just go back and examine the extravagant gray mustache that was mounted on his upper lip back in Murder on the Orient Express. This Hercule Poirot has either found the fountain of youth or discovered hair dye. And by the way, his mustache has grown back in all of its multi-tiered, gravity-defying glory after the stunning conclusion of Death on the Nile. Poirot is now somewhat happily retired in Venice, and is successfully avoiding any involvement in mysteries, unusual occurrences, and any other business that requires detection. His days are now spent tending his garden, in an excellent costume that involves a bowler hat, an elaborate apron that is strapped to his legs, and small cloth booties tied over his patent leather shoes. That is, until his old friend Ariadne Oliver asks his assistance in unmasking an apparent phony medium, at a seance to be held on Halloween night. Things quickly get out of hand, the bodies start dropping, and just when he thought he was out, they pull him back in. The movie is very, very loosely based on Agatha Christie's Halloween Party, and by the end of it, the only remaining vestiges of that novel are a handful of character names and a couple of plot elements that are moved around and given other significance in this telling. The one thing that I wanted to mention, which I'm sure many people already know, is that Kenneth Branagh sowed the seeds of this movie we have now in his 2021 film Belfast, based on his own childhood, when a character receives a copy of Halloween Party as a gift. Belfast is a really wonderful film, and it was fun that he tied in this series that he's become increasingly more associated with as part of that other, very personal film, as well as paying tribute to his mother, who is herself an Agatha Christie fan. But, I'm sure you're wondering, what did I think of the movie? And without giving too much away early on, I enjoyed it immensely. I know Kenneth Branagh and these movies get a lot of heat from many Agatha Christie devotees. So hopefully I'm not causing too many of you to stop watching this based on my opinion, but I found it a quite well told, beautiful looking mystery with a real sense of atmosphere. The first thing that sets it apart from the first two entries in the series is that it's a much smaller feeling movie. Apart from the opening and closing scenes that expand the scope of the movie to include sweeping, lovingly photographed shots of Venice, the whole movie takes place within the confines of this ancient palazzo in the course of one night. It's a smaller cast, there are fewer big names among the ensemble, and it just felt like a really confident, focused movie. When the first two relied on numerous grand, CGI-enhanced backdrops and casts that were filled with whoever was fairly popular in the year or two leading up to their release, A Haunting in Venice has a very compact, intense story to tell, and it gets right down to business. There is probably CGI used here to remove the modern conveniences that Venice may now sport, and Kelly Reilly and Michelle Yeoh were probably cast just as much for their higher profiles courtesy of Yellowstone and that movie that eventually ended up winning Michelle Yeoh her Oscar as they were for their talent, but the movie doesn't really feel like it leans on that supposed star power in the way the Gal Gadot scenes in Death on the Nile did. The one similarity that all three definitely share is the need to sequester Poirot and all of our suspects in one location. here becoming trapped due to a storm that makes gondola travel impossible. The novel Halloween Party has no such conceit, but as I said, that's just one of innumerable changes. Kenneth Branagh is a very interesting director. He has made movies that one could say are fairly workmanlike in their approach. Jack Ryan's Shadow Recruit is a good enough movie, but you don't walk away from it reflecting on the distinct visual style. A Haunting in Venice is anything but workmanlike. When he cares about the subject material enough, as I believe he does here, he goes all out to present a film in the wildest, most visually daring way he can, without hopefully losing the audience. The closest comparison would be his film Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. That is a far more grisly movie, particularly in its last act. But it also has the effect of the movie basically grabbing you by the lapels and shouting, "Don't get too comfortable, you're in for a wild ride!" And right from the opening shot of A Haunting in Venice, he and cinematographer Harris Zamberlukos serve up a dizzying array of Dutch angles, incredibly stylized shots that symbolize the disorienting events that Poirot is experiencing, shots with huge amounts of negative space, leaving you wondering if we're just supposed to be enjoying the wonderfully detailed sets that these characters are ambling through, or if we're meant to be on guard should a figure appear in the corner of the frame. There are shots locked on Poirot's face as he rushes through the halls, occasional black and white flashbacks, probably the main stylistic holdover from Death on the Nile, and finally a spiraling, magnificent closing shot that continues circling the city while the credits roll. And despite all this, there is something so warm and sumptuous about the cinematography. The imagery can build tension just in how unusual it is, yet the movie still has such an inviting feel to it. And the exteriors are grand, crisp, and feel authentic in a way that the prior films in this series haven't been able to achieve. Similarly, the production design is fantastic. The setting, as I've mentioned, is this decaying palazzo with a dark past. And the house, whether it's haunted or not, which is a big part of the movie, feels as though it's rotting, with the dim lighting, the peeling walls, and yet it's also beautiful. There is wrought iron work and so many little details that all contribute to the eerie tone that the movie captures. And whereas so many movies have sets and locations that obviously took a team of people a huge amount of work to complete, but then let it fade into the background, this movie uses those details to continually ratchet up the tension. There's an ornate clock that depicts the Garden of Eden, with Adam and Eve revolving through it while the serpent winds its way up a tree. There are gargoyles that oversee the events impassively, marble statues that cast shadows on the wall, and every item, every room of the palazzo is utilized from, as I said, every conceivable angle. So while it is a largely one-location movie, it always feels fresh and it forces you to look at everything from a new perspective. In comparison to Death on the Nile, where the monochromatic interior of the Karnak felt entirely too anachronistic for my tastes, the set design here really immerses you in the world, from that tiny bathroom with a mysteriously defective tap to the waterlogged basement. But back to the story. A Halloween party does occur close to the beginning. That much is retained from the book, but whereas in the book it's a fairly innocuous celebration filled with children's games that I assume have largely gone out of fashion, the party here, thrown for the local orphans, is a frankly terrifying ordeal. And I'm sure not a one of those kids would sleep that night. There is a shadow puppet show to illustrate the morbid history of the building, which was itself an orphanage. It's very well designed, even if it feels out of place in what's supposed to be 1947, but it does get a lot of exposition out of the way in a style that feels visual, even if someone is just narrating the shadowy images that are thrown up on the wall. Even before this, the movie's atmosphere is settled upon during the scene where Poirot and friends ride in gondolas to reach the party. The sound nearly drops out, and we watch as they glide through the canals propelled by masked, cloak-wearing gondoliers. Nothing remotely creepy has even happened yet, but that scene definitely gets you primed for what is to come. The seance is definitely the most unsettling sequence in the movie, and there are still aspects to it that I'm unsure of how much is meant to be taken literally and how much can be explained by the film's resolution. As I said, I don't really watch horror movies, and during the seance it was confirming why I don't, but as a scary sequence, it works. Speaking of the scares, many people more accustomed to the horror genre would probably find this movie tame at best, and I suppose it is. There are a fair number of standard jump scares, silence, 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 and then loud noise, but at the same time, some of them really work. The scariest parts, though, are in the silence, where you really can't explain why something is wrong, but you know something is. Seeing all of this begin to affect Poirot is also very effective. Speaking of jump scares, though, I'm not sure if this was intended or not, but there is a bird that is introduced in a close-up, squawking loudly, and I wondered if that was an intentional reference to Citizen Kane, which also utilizes this method of making sure the audience is paying attention. The murder in the original book is very dark. A child is drowned in a bucket of water, after all. Here, they don't do that, but the method they settle on is quite shocking and violent anyway. The bobbing for apples drowning is hinted towards, as Poirot himself is nearly killed in just such a manner. That scene also works very well. It's suspenseful, and the lack of musical build-up contributes to feeling as though he's not as alone as he appears. And now we come to another, possibly controversial opinion of mine. I think Kenneth Branagh makes a fantastic Poirot. Does he look like the character described in the books? No. Does he always act like him? Again, no. But we have David Suchet for that. And that whole series still exists and is easily accessible. Kenneth Branagh is great doing the dark, haunted Poirot, afraid to be drawn back into the world of death and vicious killers. And he's just as great playing up the humor of the little Belgian. There is a moment here where Poirot seems to just make up an expression that is meant to explain why he's getting involved in this case, and is told that that is not an expression in any language. I laughed very hard at that, and at several other points too. So from the directorial side, he knows not to get the audience bogged down in relentless darkness, but to always make sure to sprinkle in just enough comedy to balance out the darker aspects of the story, without feeling like you're getting tonal whiplash. And from the acting side, he knows just how to deliver those lines where he plays up Poirot's pomposity. Is he the definitive Poirot? Absolutely not. But he's clearly having a wonderful time playing him. And when that is so obvious, you have to be pretty cynical to not get at least some enjoyment from that as well. The Poirot we meet here is dealing with his having been surrounded by tragedy his whole life. The fact that every time he arrives somewhere, it's either because of a heinous crime or a death occurs shortly thereafter. He's also at a place where he has lost his faith. This hasn't really been delved into so far in these movies, and it would be interesting if they would. I believe in the later David Suchet adaptations, particularly his Murder on the Orient Express, Poirot's Catholicism becomes a larger part of the character. In this movie, the way that part of the story resolves itself isn't wholly satisfying. The fact that Poirot is a tortured hero now is another element that is carried over from Death on the Nile. And I didn't love that there, and I still don't. But if you're going to make that a part of him, I wish it would get more than just lip service. On a lighter note, that fake mustache he's sporting is very impressive. When he's dragged out of the water pail, you can see it start to sag, and the meticulously waxed waves fall flat during the scene. It's still a crazy design for that very crucial part of the Poirot look, but they're committed to it, even if it changes to some extent with every movie. For the rest of the cast, I'm not going to touch on everyone, but the performances are largely very impressive and work together well. Tina Fey was probably the biggest head-scratcher, at least prior to watching. Her work as Ariadne Oliver is very good when she's in wisecracking, smart-aleck mode, constantly treating Poirot as though he's far rustier than he really is. When she's expected to shoulder some more dramatic weight, she's less convincing. Michelle Yeoh as the medium Joyce Reynolds is also not bad, but her role is a cipher the whole time she's on screen. I'm guessing that's intended. The character is meant to be somewhat ambiguous, especially concerning her abilities and her intentions, but I wish there was more to her. Kelly Reilly plays Rowena Drake, another recycled character name from the book, here a former opera singer whose daughter is the unfortunate girl they're trying to communicate with during the seance. She works very well as this fragile, broken woman who is trying to work past this tragedy. Probably the best work in the movie, outside of the lead performance, is from Jamie Dornan and Jude Hill, who Kenneth Branagh cast once again as father and son after they previously played a young Kenneth Branagh stand-in and his own father in Belfast. Jamie Dornan is good as the battle-fatigue-plagued doctor, but I found him almost underused. There's a lot of emotion brewing under the surface, and he does a lot with just wearied glances, always reminding us that he's just teetering on the brink of a breakdown. But it's Jude Hill that is the true MVP of the movie. He's strong, but superstitious and also wise and mature beyond his years, caring for and comforting his father at an age when that really shouldn't have to be his job. It's obvious that Branagh sees himself in Jude Hill, and they even share a moment where Poirot says as much to him, which I thought was nice. The connections between Belfast and this film actually do a fine job of complementing one another. There are a handful of other characters, and it does take some time to learn how everyone is connected to one another, but if you give the movie the patience it requires, and deserves, everything, or almost everything, is explained. In amongst the suspense and things that are literally going bump in the night, the movie does settle into the usual interrogate everyone individually formula, but even that is given a few little tweaks. There's a nice scene where the interrogations of Joyce Reynolds' two assistants are intercut, as Poirot uses them against each other. And one final note before we discuss the more spoilerific sections of the movie, I wonder if Kenneth Branagh has a particular affection for Meet Me in St. Louis. Those assistant characters speak very fondly of it, and the reminiscent glow of a classic film again had me thinking of Belfast, with the chitty chitty bang bang sequence and how it filled that audience with awe. And now, spoilers. I really love the scenes where Poirot quickly and handily reveals the truth of what's going on. First is at the seance, where he unmasks the trickery that is being used to orchestrate part of the charade, pointing out clues that led him to the rigged typewriter and rattling off how amateur it all seems to a man of his brilliance. He may as well just do this at the end. And then, in a real departure from the book, Ariadne Oliver is exposed as being part of the scam, in an effort to discredit him and reinvigorate her own flagging reputation. That scene is quite good as well, as he angrily reveals how she and his bodyguard were working with Joyce Reynolds. I don't have a particular love of Ariadne Oliver, so this change to her character doesn't bother me, but if someone were a big fan of hers, I can understand that rankling them. However, if Captain Hastings or Miss Lemon were revealed to be a traitor to Poirot in some film version down the line, that might concern me more. The identity of the killer is Rowena Drake, who was slowly poisoning her daughter to keep her dependent upon her, which led to her accidentally being killed. The only reason I really began to suspect her was the fact that Rowena Drake is one of the two killers in Halloween Party, so they do keep the victim and killer names as they were originally written. But everything else, the motivation, the way in which Poirot discovers who is responsible, all of that is changed. Which is quite bold. The idea of wanting to, if not beat a finale written by Agatha Christie, at least write something that's as good as, is a hard goal to set out for yourself. And what we got is all right. I love the setup of the little hand rake in the rooftop garden and how that is used to simulate the claw symbol of the ghosts that apparently inhabit the house. But that does lead me to one nitpick. When Poirot is revealing how everything played out, we see Rowena use that rake to claw the back of Poirot's robe, which was never mentioned earlier, as well as claw the back of Joyce Reynolds before tossing her to her death impaled on the statue. These claw marks were apparently going to allow Rowena Drake to pass off the murders as the work of some mysterious phantom. But then the second murder, that of the doctor, occurs in a locked room, where she is unable to claw his back to tie it to the other murder. Speaking of that second murder, though, that was the part that I found hardest to believe, the fact that she was able to convince him to kill himself in a brief phone call, using threats against his son to incentivize him. There is some setup given with his attempted suicide following World War II, which could mean he's more susceptible to this suggestion, but I still think it's a stretch. And the movie does leave open the possibility that there was in fact a ghost at play. I'm glad that, even if that's what we're supposed to believe, that the ghost didn't really affect any part of the actual mystery, other than potentially frightening Rowena into falling to her own death during the climax. And why did Poirot keep that mask and robe on so long? I would think it to be much more in his character to discard them as soon as Joyce Reynolds walked away. The answer is because they want Poirot to be mistaken for her, and the only way is to cover him in a long black robe. Movies need things to happen, I guess. This wasn't an elegantly plotted moment, but we're past it pretty quickly. But then, I loved the final tide of the novel when it's revealed that Leopold, Jude Hill's character, was the one blackmailing Rowena all along, which led to her murdering the two people she suspected of being the blackmailers. And then that this blackmail money is supposed to be used to send the two assistants to America to live out the dream that Meet Me in St. Louis planted in their minds. That was a final twist that I didn't expect whatsoever, and ties things up nicely. So it's not as satisfying as a true Agatha Christie ending would be, but it's a valiant effort, and probably a fun challenge for the screenwriter, Michael Green, to tackle. and it ends the movie with Poirot back on the case, ready to begin taking new clients as though his little gray cells had just been lying in wait to be unleashed once again. So if you're on the fence about whether or not you should watch this movie, I'd say give it a try. As an adaptation of Halloween Party, it's not good. You could even say it's terrible. But as a Poirot film, it's actually a lot of fun, even if that fun comes with some very intense, scary moments mixed in. And it's probably the best looking of this series so far. I definitely like it more than Death on the Nile. I haven't watched Murder on the Orient Express since it came out in 2017, so I can't say which of those I would prefer, but there's a surprising possibility that this is my favorite of the bunch. I have no idea if Kenneth Branagh is going to be given the opportunity to continue this series, but I sure hope he is. If they keep the stories and casts tight and unique like this one, I have a feeling there could be good things to come. But if you have watched this movie and really did not like it, that's fine. I understand the disappointment many people have with this series' creative liberties that are taken. For the broader audience, these might be the only Poirot stories that many people will see on screen, and what they're getting isn't necessarily an accurate depiction of the character and books that Agatha Christie spent her life creating. But again, there is a far more faithful adaptation already out there, called Halloween Party, starring David Suchet. So I think there is room for both. If this is the last that we see of Kenneth Branagh's Poirot, he went out on a high note. In the end, it's an interesting trilogy of films in an era when these sorts of mysteries don't get made all that often. Besides these, we have Knives Out, which thankfully was an excellent standalone movie that was never sullied with any sequels made for Netflix. Anyway, I watched right to the end of these credits, and unfortunately, it did not end with the words, "Hercule Poirot will return," but I'll keep my fingers crossed. Thanks very much for watching. Adios for now.